Our next speaker is Carlos O'Neill. Before I hand it over to him, you just mentioned that he is the Technical Information Security Officer at Invesco. Now, this is a publicly traded financial firm, but Carlos has spent his career in a number of different industries, helping organizations in technology with Intuit, in the insurance industry, on the defense side with General Dynamics and the DoD. And Carlos is going to be talking about how to get your security team ready for the cloud. Carlos, hand it over to you.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, SANS organization, for allowing me to have this platform and share these thoughts with you. All being told, probably the first large-scale talk I've held, so a little nervous, but we'll get through it. So, as mentioned, in terms of background, currently I'm a security officer with Invesco. My domain there is cloud security, and working with teams to make sure that as a multinational company that our cloud deployments are secure. And in that, it presented a challenge of how do we prepare our teams for the cloud. So in our agenda today, I'll go ahead and skip the introduction since I'm sort of doing that now and start, get right into the talk and share some interesting ideas with you guys. So that's me. We can skip that for now. So shifting left, preparing our security teams for the cloud, right? So as the really the current events have shown, and even prior to that, is that cloud is everywhere, and we're seeing organizations that are leveraging it for really unique business opportunities. Municipalities are using it to keep their services running when the local facilities are impacted. And so in and of essence, if you run a security team, if you're part of a security team, you will have to at some point embrace the cloud. So what are the advantages of cloud? If you don't currently work in cloud today, I'm sure that you have some questions in terms of what are the advantages, why are companies looking to go to the cloud? And I've captured a few here. So one is the cloud allows teams to build and deploy solutions quickly. So if you think about the classic or on-prem IT model, you have energy spent with procurement, racking and stacking, setting up the system, and then finally handing it over to the requester or development team. And all of that takes time. And, I think one thing that the industry is showing us now is that you have to move quickly, especially if you're in a very competitive space. Secondly, the cloud allows us to be elastic and make those quick pivot points based on demand, based on cyclical demand requirements. And it's really unmatched, right? So if you invest in a physical hardware and decide, oh no, we've undersized it or we've oversized it, there's not really much you can do there to reclaim that investment, whereas the cloud allows us to grow and shrink compute, storage, and other capabilities on demand. Thirdly, is less responsibility for the cloud customer, so the person who's creating those cloud accounts. So with on-prem or DC deployments, we own the whole stack from a security perspective. We own the physical security of the appliance within that location, unless we're using a colo, for which they assume some of that responsibility. But all the way up the stack and life cycle of that system is our responsibility. When we leverage cloud accounts, cloud partnerships, we're transferring some of that responsibility to our cloud service provider. And depending on the organization's desires, transfer of that as opposed to attempting to mitigate can be really advantageous. Lastly is the consumption model. So because the cloud is pay as you go, it allows teams of all sizes to experiment, to build, and to ultimately launch and grow while only paying for the resources they consume. So when you couple all these things together, it really speaks to the fast, high velocity pace of business today. And cloud is really driving a lot of those advances that we're seeing. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background because I didn't sort of want to assume that everyone knew everything about the cloud before we get into the whole shift left mentality. So here we just wanted to lay out some of the consumption models. And this is the way that teams can consume cloud services. So first we have infrastructure as a service. And this really represents the standard compute assumption model. So here's where a vendor basically provides clients with pay-as-you-go access to things like storage, networking, compute. And this is very similar to what you may be running in your co-located or your on-prem DC, such as VMware, where you're just really provisioning all aspects of virtual machining. We have platform as a service, where the provider provides you with the cloud environment, where you can use their backend to deliver your applications. And each one of these, as we'll see later, has a lower responsibility model back on the customer. And then lastly, software as a service. It's a consumption model where the customer of a SaaS provider essentially consumes that via thin client or browser. All of the other elements that come with that is the responsibility of the SaaS provider. And so through these additional models, you'll see later that we have sort of a sliding or cascading responsibility matrix. And this is that model. So what we're seeing here is we have on-prem, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, right? We just covered those. So on-prem, as I mentioned, we own the whole stack from physical security to data classification and accountability. As we move right, which is sort of counterintuitive to the idea of moving left, but in this case, to move right, we see that when you adopt IaaS, the physical security piece is then assumed from a responsibility standpoint from the CSP or the cloud service provider. And PaaS and SaaS, again, as we move to that direction, even more responsibility is shifted. One thing to note here is that regardless of which model we adopt, the job of securing our data remains with the customer. So although it's not represented here, I think it's very important to understand that we can shift some responsibility to our cloud service providers, but at the end of the day, we are responsible for our data. So what are some of the challenges that security teams or security in general may be facing as it relates to the cloud? For me, direct experience with this is as we see that different groups within the organization start adopting cloud, we see this divergence between two of the classic, one classic model and a new model. So one is the waterfall project methodology. Is very, very sequential, that you have your dependencies and, whatever that Gantt burn down looks like, that's what you're going to follow. And then many cloud deployments today are run using agile methodology. And agile is a very iterative approach where you do not have to follow sort of that waterfall approach. And the challenge with this is that classically, our security teams are still thinking waterfall, while the business or development teams are adopting agile. And then when you try and sync those teams up, what you find is you have a velocity mismatch where agile is much quicker, things are happening much sooner, and waterfall, and then it just creates, I think, a lot of friction and confusion between teams. Secondly is the organization structure. So as you think about adopting cloud in general, it's really important to have the right structure that supports that digital transformation and adoption of cloud technologies. A lot of organizations today may not necessarily put the time and energy into looking at the structure to make sure that it is supportive of their cloud aspirations. Gaps in existing policies. So if we think about on-prem, right, if you have challenges on-prem, adopting cloud is not necessarily going to solve those challenges. So if there are gaps in the policies on-prem, those gaps will follow you to the cloud. And more importantly, as you start to adopt cloud-specific services, it becomes more important to go back to those living documents and make sure that they are phrased in a way that your teams can consume them easily and understand where the guidance is, and they are not left wondering, this policy says I have to have AV, but what if I'm adopting a PaaS service? Do I need to have AV? Sometimes that causes confusion. So we want to make sure that our policies are living and moving and migrating in step with us to the cloud. Additionally, security teams that are operating on-prem today have made investment in security technologies. Things like SIEM, we've heard other speakers talk about SIEM and other tooling and capabilities. Well, as cloud adoption happens, there may be gaps that are exposed because those tool investments don't necessarily extend well to the cloud. Infrastructure is now code. So, security teams have to become comfortable with the idea that entire environments can be built via script. And that is a different mode of operating than the classic sense I mentioned earlier, where you have a team who's going to, procure it, rack it and stack it, install it, get it set up, and then transfer it over to the requester, the requesting team. So all of this happens faster now. You can build entire environments. And so the question then becomes, how do you secure that code that then builds the infrastructure? Last but not least is training and staffing. So as teams and organizations are adopting cloud, it becomes really important to make sure that there is a built training program that allows existing team members to then go and grab additional cloud security training. But then it's also important to understand that as you move forward, there will be opportunities to bring in new staff. And from a security management perspective, we need to start looking at building in additional cloud security requirements into those job descriptions. And so that we're bringing in fresh talent that has that great mix of, overall security guidance, but then can go into specific challenges that are being faced in the cloud. So why shift left? What does it really mean? And so, let's take a look before I get too far into it. But so the classic security engagement model looks something like this. So you have, this is a security software development model we're seeing here. And normally security is brought in at the very last stage where the team has gone through and they've made changes, they've feature adds and removes, and all of a sudden they're ready to go live. The business is waiting for it. And then somehow security gets wind of this new system. And because security, which is represented here by the blue arrow, because we get access to it late, and we've not had an opportunity to inject value earlier into the stream, most often security is painted as a blocker. Because now at this point, prior to operations, we have a load of questions. Secure coding practices, vulnerability assessment for the tools, hardening of the underlying supporting systems. There's so many things to think about. And so this classic model here does not extend well, and is really, it is time to think about how we shift left. So shifting left, the best way I can describe it with this graphic is really about taking security as a module and placing security at the earlier elements of product or solution design. So at every stage represented here by a rectangle, security should have a seat at the table and should be not only in attendance, but also providing value back to the team. So things like system requirements. So as system requirements are developed, things like endpoint agents, any other type of additional endpoint installations can be factored into the requirements so that there are no surprises on either side of the ball. Secure coding practices. So the idea that our security teams are running our security coding tools, are doing a security review of the coding along the way, so that by the time that we get to operations, number one, you've built, by the time you get to operations, you've built this working relationship with the solutions team. security has been present at each stage in providing value and is starting to be viewed more as a team member and asset as opposed to a roadblock. So how do we make the shift, right? There are a few elements I think in my experience and especially with my teams that we've looked at on how we actually produce this shift in security. First and foremost is team structure. So we touched on this. We have to make sure that we have the right people, the right talent, and overall that we have the right conduits for communication between all of these teams. We have to look at our project methodologies. We have to address training and opportunities for existing staff and new staff in terms of bringing in new talent. We have to update our policies, standards, and procedures. Evaluate current controls. This is really about identifying gaps in our current tooling. And then we're creating a plan on how we're going to mitigate and approach those gaps in the cloud. And then lastly, I think is really the coolest piece of it is thinking about event-driven security. And we'll touch on that coming forward. So team structure, what's the challenge? So if you work in IT today or you have aspirations to work on a team in IT, silos are just everywhere, right? So with the graphic on the right, the challenge with silos is that, number one, silos inhibit bidirectional communication in most cases, not always, but in most cases, and proficiency in one silo does not necessarily transfer to proficiency and knowledge in the other. So in this case, although these silos are labeled manufacturing and recently acquired, if you really think about two major silos, if you think about your app development, your developers, and you think of IT, right? So proficiency from your developer's perspective on writing code doesn't necessarily transfer well into your silo in IT security and the challenges there. And then what we find is that there's no scaffolding between the two to allow the two teams to have that bidirectional communication and a bidirectional offer of value. So what's really the answer? So I think the answer is jettison the idea of operating in silos, which admittedly is harder to do in practice. But what we should do is think about adopting a team of teams approach. So you take the best, or really it's not, excuse me, it doesn't have anything to do with the best, but you take your developers, you take your security folks, you take your compliance, your governance, and you form a team that is responsible for delivering cloud solutions for your organization. What this does is, since everyone is on the same squad, now there are no barriers between communication and value offering. And so it builds pathways between silos. Additionally, when we think again about the major composition of these teams, development, security, your operations teams, and there's some niche teams in there depending on the organization, but as a whole, this is a representative of the majority of the folks that we want on the squad. And what does that really culminate into? And it really culminates into the idea of DevSecOps. So to where when you look at this graphic, you have the continuum between development and operations, but sort of behind the scenes, but all encompassing is the idea of security. And so at every part of this continuum, security is present and able to provide value along that continuum. And then you have one cohesive team of teams or squad that's delivering your cloud solutions. So I mentioned agile, and I wanted to take a time and just sort of expand on it just a little bit for folks who may not have, may not run on agile teams. But again, we want to, I say abandon is kind of strong language, but I think we want to politely walk away from waterfall and think about using agile, as most of the teams that we'll be working with in many organizations are already running in agile sprints. And so this is really just about matching velocity so that not only can we offer value, but we understand how the other team is going about they're executing their project tasks and what their challenges are, and then we can move in lockstep again at the sort of this match of velocity. If teams decide to embrace agile, again, first point already spoken to, it gives you the ability to match velocity with your other teams. It gives the security team to iterate and develop more secure solutions. And so instead of the waterfall methodology where you have these dependencies and then you're blocked, and there's no accounting for that within the waterfall methodology. With agile, you can iterate, and it allows the security teams to think outside of the box and not be blocked off because there is a blocker along that singular chain. The last point here is integrating the security requirements early. So security teams who then join these agile teams can provide that value early on, which is most likely going to be very appreciated by the developers. And it removes the notion that security is a blocker when it comes to deploying solutions and technologies. So training. So training is really important as we attempt to shift left. We have to be able to speak knowledgeably about the technologies for which we are securing. And what's really important here is that teams should focus on gaining knowledge in a few key areas. One we've already talked about, which is the agile methodology. Second is Python as a scripting language. Python is used throughout many of the cloud service providers, and gives the security team the ability to start automating some of the common security tasks that they may be executing on a daily basis, and then leads to more advanced things like event-driven security and functions as a service. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Many of the logs that you receive back from these cloud service providers are in JSON format. And so we want our teams to be familiar with JSON and its format, so that if there's an opportunity where we have to go and look at the raw log output, we understand what we're looking at, we're familiar and comfortable with what we're seeing. From a cloud architecture perspective, a good understanding of how cloud solutions are built, whether you're talking AWS or Azure or GCP or any of the other niche service providers as well, is understand just overall the architecture. I think helps a lot when we think about assessing the security of cloud solutions. And then I have cloud security. And I have that because I think as a whole, 80% of security in and of itself applies to cloud. And then there are some really specific use cases. And I think here what we're saying is that be familiar with what cloud challenges as it relates to security. And I think that will overall create a well-rounded security team and opportunity. Additionally, I guess I had to mention that SANS has some new courses. I haven't had a chance to take these specifically, but I did take the time to go through and look at the syllabus and look at the breakdown. And Sec 488, Cloud Security Essentials, 510, Public Cloud Security for AWS, Azure, GCP, and 584, Cloud Native Security, Defending Containers and Kubernetes. I feel like these three classes really created a broad foundation for security teams to really bring their people up to speed on cloud, and go even further and start thinking about how to defend these solutions in the cloud. There are last 2 points here. There's white papers, and so AWS, Azure, are in a little bit of GCP. I think their documentation to me is a little lacking, but white papers are released by cloud service providers, and they contain a wealth of information on how the services work. And so definitely I would recommend the teams, aside from paid or professional training, is to look at the white papers. There's a lot of gold buried inside of them. So we mentioned policies and standards. So as a way of shifting left, evaluating current policies and standards is going to be a must. So many organizations today, if you look at current policies and standards, there's going to be a gap represented by just how the adoption of cloud technologies is much different in some ways. And as I mentioned, we want to make sure that teams that are referring to these policies and standards have clear and easily digestible language that helps them deploy solutions securely with input from security partners. We want to identify these gaps. We want to work with your governance teams or whoever owns the policies within your organization, identify gaps and update policies as needed, and obviously publish those for consumption. And then, when we think about, if your organization doesn't have existing policies, or you're wondering what things should we be thinking about, I offered a few key areas. One is identity and access management. We learned a lot about that in the previous talk. Cryptography and key management is really important, as remember that regardless of who owns what aspect of cloud, we own the responsibility of securing our data. And then lastly is to think about the idea of codifying our policies and standards. And so using, much of my experience here is with AWS, but with using service control policies and other like services from Azure GCP, we want to start thinking about how do we take these policies and create guardrails within the cloud that allow our teams to build and deploy. And then those guardrails act as bumpers. And when there's a change or a deviation beyond the standard, there's a soft adjustment. It may be a notification via email. It may be pausing specific services that violate those policies or standards, and then working on educating the teams going forward so that they don't hit the guardrails. So when we think about evaluating our current tool investment, I think when we see that viewpoint, you're going to see that there's some gaps there that are exposed. And so some of the items that I listed here for us to think about were our endpoint agents, right? So if you're deploying AV, EDR, any other type of advanced endpoint agent, those tools must also then follow your IaaS investments in the cloud. And the same with things like DLP, your SIEM solution, load balancers, and naturally your firewalls. And so we want to leverage that as much as we can because we've already made that investment. But then again, the second bullet here is identifying the gaps in those tools and then embracing native technologies within the cloud tenants to fill some of those gaps. So one of the few areas we want to focus on is logging analytics, whether you're using any of the major three. There's robust logging capabilities such as CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and so leverage those as much as you can. Storage, so storing our security logs. If you operate a SIEM today on-prem, probably the largest spend is going to be on storage of those logs. And so there's some advantages to embracing some of the cheaper storage capabilities within the cloud for those access controls, and then naturally key management, both for your identities and also for your data in the cloud. So a few example controls, again, I wanted to do an even mix between the services I'm more familiar with, AWS, and then also include some Azure. But things like Athena that allow you to query your logs that are stored in S3 using SQL-like commands. And these are tools that, as long as your tenant is set up correctly and you're sending logs to S3, you can use Athena to do logging analytics. We're seeing that cloud service providers are deploying new and more advanced security services that can be adopted. And so AWS has launched GuardDuty, which provides AI-driven threat detection within the cloud. And so, what we're seeing here is, as you see some of those gaps that are exposed by on-prem investments that don't extend well to the cloud, you may have an opportunity to leverage native controls before having to go out and buy a third party or procure a tool to do that in the cloud. Touching back on Azure, they have Sentinel, which can see and stop threats. It is, for all intent and purpose, a SIEM in the cloud. And Sentinel can actually not only protect and detect Azure workloads, but it can also do other cloud environments as well, which makes it really, and it gives it an advantage over, for say, guard duty. Defender, you can use Defender with Security Center to do the hybrid workload and protect it with your additional security. And then things like XDR and RDP brute force attacks can be detected. And so what we're saying here is that, again, as you look at your tooling, think about opportunities for adoption of these services within the cloud, and then identify and then procure when you've gotten to a point where you're very certain that you can't fill that gap with a native control. So what's the end state? So we've talked about training, we've talked about policies, we've talked about project methodologies, and so what does the end state look like? And so for me, it's event-driven security. So as we match the velocity of our teams that are adopting cloud services, and we start building in guardrails, we also want to start reacting much quicker to events that are happening in the cloud. We mentioned that infrastructure now is being built and destroyed via code. And so we may receive, if we think about this, you may receive a notification of a compromise or an unauthorized machine startup. And by the time that alert reaches your team and they're ready to act on, that resource could be destroyed, it could be shut down. And so it becomes really important for us to react quicker to these events as they're being generated. And so this is an example of an event-driven security mechanism. And so here what we have is, we have excuse me, let me just move that. We have a S3 bucket on the left. There is a compliance check that is being performed by AWS config. The change in that bucket fires off an event to AWS CloudWatch. And then CloudWatch triggers a Lambda function. And that Lambda function may, for example, say this bucket should not be made public at any cost. And so the Lambda function will then go and turn off the public access. And then it will send notification to teams that have subscribed to this SNS topic and letting them know that this bucket was made public, the Lambda has changed that state. And so the advantage here is we think about more than just the common S3 bucket is being made public scenario. But here, we didn't have to wait for an analyst to receive word from the SIEM or for the SIEM to go through its correlation or for someone to just happen across the impactful change. Because we're using a combination of native tooling and scripting, we can see that we can now react quicker without waiting for human interaction. And admittedly, we don't want to automate everything, but in cases like this where there's, whether it applies to an existing guardrail or policy or standard, I think we're safe to say that we can actually create these functions based off of the event-driven security, the events that are being fired within the cloud tenant to react quickly. This lessens the opportunity for attackers to take advantage of things like this bucket being made public. And we're still getting the notification, we're still getting the metadata and opportunity to educate our teams who may have fired off this event. So in summary, shifting left is really thinking about involving security at every stage, increasing and in some cases matching the velocity of security teams, developing hybrid security controls as we'll naturally want to leverage the investment into our on-prem tooling, but then thinking about new and exciting ways to leverage native controls and or hybrid controls, which allow our teams to correctly secure the cloud. Think about codifying security and compliance checks, and that sort of is a nod to the event-driven security. And so when we think about common events or things that are developed in security standards and policies, we can use the cloud environments and those services to quickly respond to compliance checks and give us that quick reaction time we need because things are built and destroyed in the cloud so fast. And then lastly, shifting left is about breaking down silos, forming squads, sharing information, sharing value ahead, early on in the project or solution lifecycle, so that there are no surprises when it is time to go to operations. So that's what I have. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share this with you. And I'll pause for questions.
Hey, Carlos, great job. That was a lot of great information. One question here for you. You talk about shifting left and, you mentioned abandoned waterfall earlier. And you also noted some places to go learn more about cloud security specifically. But, there's one comment here. Well, what about DevSecOps? Where do you suggest people go to learn more about DevSecOps and kind of the things and the tools they could use in terms of this shifting left approach?
Yeah, so there are, that's first off, very good question. And essentially that's exactly what we're talking about is DevSecOps. So I'll drop a link in my hallway, but there is a company called Atlassian, and Atlassian has a really good learning library for DevSecOps and agile in general. So I think that would be a good start. And I think there are a lot of books that are published that also I'll send links in my my Slack channel there that help really bridge the gap between DevSecOps and bring you up to speed on it.
Perfect. That sounds great.